so they're just basically minerals, which are rocks. And so they're kind of highly complex rocks. And rocks take a long, long time to break down, whereas tissue is made of organic material, and that's going to get broken down very quickly. But our living skeleton, our skeleton when we're alive, is not just mineral. It is not just rock. There is a lot of living organic material there. There is those minerals, but there's also cells and nerves and blood vessels. All of those together are going to make up our skeletal system. And it's not static. And by that, I mean it doesn't form itself and then sit there and just maintain homeostasis and not really change. It's constantly changing. Well, what we're going to see is that the bone in our body is constantly dissolving and reforming all at the same time. The calcium and things are constantly going into and out of that bone. People who study bone are going to study osteology, just like histology was the study of tissues, and cytology was the study of cells. Osteology is the study of the bone. So like we said, skeletal system is not just hard bone. It's bone, it's cartilage, it's ligaments, it's the blood vessels and the nerves that are in all of it. It's a complex mixture of things. We already learned about cartilage. We learned about it as a tissue type. Cartilage in this case is primarily going to be the beginning stages of a bone. What we're going to see is that in one type of bone growth, the existing bone is going to lay down cartilage and then convert that cartilage into hard bone. Also, a lot of our bone is going to have a spot of cartilage on it, primarily in our joints. And that's going to be kind of a lubrication and protection for the hard bone, so you don't have hard bone rock, basically rock on rock. We're also going to have ligaments, and so ligaments hold bone to bone, and tendons hold muscle to bone. And so if you see a picture, and there's two bones held together by a structure, that's going to be a ligament, and if it's a muscle attached to a bone, that's going to be a tendon. Skeleton as a whole has a whole bunch of functions. Some of them obvious, some of them not. Most obvious being support. We've talked about this before, right? If I lift my arm and there's no bone in my arms are going to flop. I'm not going to be able to stand up, I'm not going to be able to walk, I'm not going to be able to do anything. We also have bones in our body that help hold things in place. Things like our pelvis hold the organs in our body. Bones can be protective. Think of our skull and our ribcage, right? They're really there for no other purpose than to protect the things that are located in them. Skeleton is for movement. It's going to allow us to move, but also allow us to move to breathe. Think of what happens to your lungs when you breathe in. They expand, right? Your chest also expands a little bit every time you breathe. That's the skeletal system taking part in that. What we're going to see is that the bones also are very, very important in maintaining levels of electrolytes in your blood. Remember, electrolytes are essentially just going to be ionic compounds. They're going to be ions flowing through your body. In this case, bones are going to be really important in dealing with calcium and phosphorus. It's also important in controlling the pH of your blood. Things like calcium and phosphate are going to act as buffers when they're in your blood. And so by taking bone, dissolving it and putting those minerals into your blood, we can help balance out pH changes. If we want to actually change the pH of our blood, we can take the buffers in our blood and put it back into the bone. And then finally, blood comes from bone marrow. And bone marrow is what we're going to see is located inside of our bones. And so you don't really think of skeletal system being important for the formation of all of your blood, but actually it is. If you had no bones, you would have no blood. So bone is kind of the common term for osseous tissue. The osseous tissue is the term that we use when we talked about our tissues. And this is a connective tissue, and the extracellular matrix is going to be hardened by minerals. So it's going to look very similar to our other connective tissues, with different fibers being present in the extracellular matrix, but it's going to take it a step further. It's essentially going to petrify it. Think of petrified wood, right? There's a tree, then it gets mineralized, and now the tree is basically gone, but there's now a rock where the tree used to be. This process is called mineralization or calcification. Primarily, a lot of people will call it calcification because it's mostly calcium, but it's not all calcium. And so mineralization is probably a more correct term. And like we've said, individual bones are considered organs. There's multiple types of tissue in that structure, and so that is, by definition, an organ, because there's bone tissue, there's bone marrow, cartilage, adipose tissue, nervous tissue, and other types of connective tissue. There's a lot of tissues that come together here, and my brain doesn't automatically make this connection, but a bone is in fact an organ. I think of organs as being soft and squishy, but a bone is in fact an organ. So there are a few general types of bones. There are flat bones, long bones, short bones, irregular bones, and sesamoid bones. So a flat bone is going to be primarily our skull. There's going to be essentially a sandwich, two hard layers with soft layer in the middle. There's long bones. Think of your arms and your legs. They're just long bones. They're going to be much longer than they are wide. And they're primarily going to be in our appendages for movement. They're long and skinny so that you can get leverage, right? Length gives you leverage in physics. Short bones are going to be very, very similar to long bones in terms of their structure, but the difference is they're essentially the same length as they are wide. So a long bone is long and skinny, a short bone is the same width, but much shorter. There are irregular bones. These are not easily put into any of the others. They're generally odd shapes. They're not going to be long and skinny. They're not going to be kind of a cube shape, and they're not flat. Think of your pelvis. We all have a picture in our mind of what a pelvis looks like. That does not fit into any of these. So that would be an irregular bone. And then there are sesamoid bones, which we're not going to talk about really at all, but these are going to be actually buried inside of a tendon to give them a little bit more structure. So remember, a tendon attaches a muscle to a bone, but a tendon is just loose it's dense connective tissue. And so it's kind of bendy and flexible. It's stretchy. Its purpose of being there is to be stretchy, but it's also flexible because of that. So if you imagine, if you put a bone running along that tendon, that's going to prevent it from bending, but the tendon itself can still stretch around that bone. We also have two types of bones in terms of their structure, their internal structure. There's compact bone and spongy bone. What you picture when you think of bone is most likely compact bone. And that's because that's on the outside of our bones. If we see a bone with our eyes, as long as it's intact, we are never going to see spongy bone. Spongy bone is just on the inside. It's going to be much less dense. It's going to be loosely organized. We'll see plenty of pictures of this. Whereas compact bone is very dense, and this is going to be highly mineralized. You're never going to have spongy bone by itself. Spongy bone will always be completely covered by compact bone. In terms of weight, our skeleton is about 3/4 of the compact bone, and then 1/4 of the spongy bone. Do you think it's the same by volume? A number of people are shaking their heads no. Why not? Right. Compact bone is dense. Spongy bone is, when you're going to see a picture, it looks just like a sponge. And so a sponge takes up a lot of space, but weighs very little. Whereas the outside, the compact bone is basically a rock. A rock is very dense. It's not very big, but it's very heavy. Okay, so now we're going to move on and start talking a little bit more about these. We're going to start with the long bone. The long bone is really what you probably picture when you think of a regular bone. So a long bone is going to have two primary parts when we look from the outside. And you're going to laugh, but that is a bone. Looks very much like a dog bone, kind of. I don't know. It doesn't look like a dog bone at all. But this is a long bone, okay? What we have here are essentially two different parts to that bone. There's the part in the middle, and then there's the two ends. The diaphysis is going to be the long part in the middle. And then you're going to have two epiphyses. So this is the diaphysis, and then you have two epiphyses. But these are essentially hollow. It's not that compact bone the whole way through. And so in the diaphysis, in the middle here, is going to be this medullary cavity. This is where a lot of the bone marrow is going to be. The epiphyses are going to be at the end. This is going to have a number of purposes. Number one, it's going to make the joints. If you take two of these long bones and put them together, you're essentially going to have one epiphysis here and then another one down here with another diaphysis there. So the epiphyses are going to be making your joints. But joints aren't just bone and bone. There's going to be muscles and things. But without the bone here to support them, they would just be floppy. So the epiphyses are going to provide the structure for your joints. And they're also going to contain some bone marrow that we'll see. This line here, we'll talk about when we talk about bone growth, the line between the diaphyses and the epiphyses is going to be where the bone is going to grow. Articular cartilage is the cartilage that you would see at the end of the epiphysis, generally coating these surfaces in here. This is a hyaline cartilage, and it's going to act as a lubrication to allow these bones to move against each other. There's also going to be some fluid here that we'll talk about in, I guess that's the next lecture, in our joints lecture. But you can imagine mineral rubbing on mineral is not going to move very well. But if you put cartilage is softer, it's kind of a little bit slippery, and it has a little bit of springiness to it. And so that's going to allow this joint to move a whole lot better. In the bone, there's going to be a whole bunch of tiny little holes. And those holes are called these nutrient foramina. They're going to allow blood vessels coming from the outside to get into the bone. Because there's a lot of living cells in the middle of that bone. Not only do they need nutrients, but remember, the bone marrow in here is going to be where the blood cells are made. And so they need to get out. And so we have this bone with all these little holes in them with small blood vessels going into it. On the very outside of the bone is something called the periosteum. And it has two layers to it. And so I'm going to put an extra 2 layers on here. In reality, the periosteum is very, very thin. It's basically invisible. It'd be very hard to take a bone and peel this off. But it's two layers. The outer layer is going to be collagen. This is going to provide some protection to our bone. It's also going to provide a nice base for things like tendons to attach to. It's a little bit loose. Collagen is a little looser than bone. So the tendons have a little bit of area that they can put their little fingers into and grab onto. This is going to have what we call perforating fibers. And so coming off of this, there's going to be some little pieces that come into the bone, and that's going to kind of act as staples to hold that periosteum on. Then on the inside of the periosteum is what we call an osteogenic layer. So when our bone is growing, it's going to grow based off of this inner layer of the periosteum. Osteogenic means making bone, right? Genesis, and osteo, bone. So this is going to contain the cells that are going to make bone. And we'll talk more about that bone formation process and the name of those cells on another slide. On the inside, and so I've kind of finished that one. You can't really see what I'm doing anymore. So let me draw another. Okay. So imagine we have this marrow cavity, and the marrow cavity actually kind of comes up into the epiphyses. There's going to be another layer here. So this is going to be separating the dense connective tissue out here from the marrow cavity. And this layer is going to be called the endosteum. Endo meaning inside or in. So this is going to be on the inside. And it's going to have cells that are able to dissolve the bone. And so there's going to be cells on the outside that are going to add bone. Then there are going to be cells on the inside, in the endosteum, that are going to dissolve the bone tissue. Well, let's look ahead. Why would you want to dissolve the bone and make the bone at the same time?
Because you get too heavy from still having the bone when you're a baby, so now you're an adult. You want to become.
Well, I mean,
That's the only thing.
yeah, go ahead.
Cells get worn down and exhausted and die.
Yeah, so cells get exhausted, worn out, and die. Bone itself, I mean, even steel and wood, we use it to build things all the time. But over time, it breaks down, right? What about things like damage? Things break down over time, but also, if I break a bone, I'm going to have to repair it. And broken bones aren't always big fractures. We're constantly getting little tiny, almost imperceptible fractures that need to be fixed. And so if you've ever fixed a crack, a lot of times you have to take a little bit out, make it neat and clean before you can fill it in and fix it. So that's going to be a reason why we need to dissolve and replace. Another reason we already talked about is the minerals in that bone are important for a lot of other physiological processes, like maintaining pH and electrolyte balance. And so sometimes you have to put it in, sometimes you have to take it out. They may not actually have to go at the same exact time, but they may be hours apart from each other. So this line between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is the epiphyseal plate, or what people a lot of times will call a growth plate. How many people have ever broken a bone, especially when you're a kid, and the doctor said you broke it at your growth plate? A lot of us, right? Hopefully, you were like me and you were just about done growing, and so you don't have one arm that's like this, right? Because if you break the growth plate, a lot of times your bone will in fact stop growing for the most part. This growth plate is cartilage. So what we're going to see is at this growth plate here and here, in a child, there's going to be cartilage here. The compact bone here and here will actually be separated from each other by a layer of cartilage. There'll just be a line of cartilage here. So it's not continuous. When our bone grows lengthwise, it's going to grow here. And so this part will grow longer and longer and longer. Because this is not attached to that, these can just kind of move with the bone as it grows. Yes, they have to get a little bit bigger to match its growth, but as we get bigger and bigger, our arm is going to get a lot longer, much longer than it is wider, right? Imagine what my arm looked like when I was very young. It was much shorter, but it probably wasn't a whole lot much narrower. So it has to get a lot longer than it does wider. So this allows that to happen. Once we're adults, this cartilage is basically gone. There's essentially no cartilage left there. It's now called an epiphyseal line. Because on an x-ray, it looks just a little bit different. It is compact bone, but because it was made at a different time, and because there was a lot of cartilage there at one point, it just looks a little bit different. Functionally, it's almost exactly the same, but it looks a little different, and so we call it an epiphyseal line. So this is a poorly drawn version of what I have, right? So what we have is we have the diaphysis in the middle here, and then two epiphyses over here. In here, there's going to be a lot of the things we talked about, and so this is a long bone. We have the epiphyses and the diaphysis. We have compact and spongy bone. So the compact bone is just on the outside. So if it's intact, we see it here. If we have it kind of cut in a cross section, we see it up here. But then here, this is spongy bone. So do you see how it looks like a sponge? It looks like if you took a sponge and then put cement over the top of the sponge. You would essentially have a bone. Here in the diaphysis is going to be our marrow cavity, and so this is bone marrow here. We'll talk about the two types, but there is red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. There's articular cartilage up here on the end of the epiphysis, and then on the very outside is the periosteum. And so here they've kind of tried to draw these little blood vessels and things here, but it's almost impossible to see even in their drawing. It's just this very, very thin layer on the outside of the bone. So those are long bones. Next are the flat bones. Almost only in our brain, our skull. Okay. When you think flat bones, think skull. If you can picture the bones in your skull, you'll be able to picture these flat bones. So again, we have compact bone and spongy bone. But instead of being long like that, it's just basically a plate. And so we have two layers of compact bone, and then there's spongy bone here. This is showing that this little joint here is a suture. We'll talk about sutures in our next lecture. That's not important for this lecture. And so the sandwich-like construction has a few different purposes. Number one, it's going to provide some shock absorption. Think if you just had a solid skull and you got hit in the head, versus if you have two layers of very hard protective stuff with a little bit of foam in the middle. And so when you get hit, this can compress a little bit and absorb some of that shock. Also, with having the spongy bone in there, we can have other processes going on. So the living cells in our bones are going to be in spongy bone. There's not going to be a whole lot other than cells in the compact bone that make compact bone. Cells that do other things are going to be found in spongy bone. Again, this has periosteum, and it's on both surfaces. If you really think about it, here, you can draw one line and go around the whole thing. But if you take one of these flat bones, you get to the end, and the compact bone just stops. And so you can't have one continuous periosteum going around the whole thing. And so we actually have two. There's one layer on top, one layer on the bottom, and that periosteum is going to serve the same purpose as it did in the long bone. Okay, so now that we know the general features of what a bone looks like, the structures that make up the parts, we can talk about the cells in the bone and the cells that are going to make our bone. So the bone as a whole is going to be cells, fibers, and ground substance. Remember, it is a connective tissue. And so this is essentially the three components of connective tissue. There's the fibers, the cells that make the fibers, and then the ground substance, which is the jelly type stuff that fills in all of the empty space. When we look at the cells in our bones, we're going to break them into four categories. There's going to be osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So osteogenic cells are stem cells. The osteogenic cells are going to make the other three types. So an osteogenic cell doesn't have a definitive purpose other than to divide continuously, to keep making more cells that will differentiate into one of the other three types. These are in the endosteum, in the inner layer of periosteum. And so you're going to find these osteogenic cells on that was the inner layer of the periosteum. I don't even remember. I guess that was this one. So this here was the bone itself. Then we had the inner layer of the periosteum. And then it's also going to be on the endosteum. So essentially, find the border between the marrow cavity and the compact bone, and there will be osteogenic cells there. And then there will be osteogenic cells on the very outside of the bone. So on the inside and outside surfaces of the bone will be our osteogenic cells. From the osteogenic cells, we will get osteoblasts. Osteoblasts make bone. I don't have a good way of memorizing this. To me, it's backwards. Blasting destroys, blows something up. If you have a good way of remembering this, let me know. I can share it with other people. But I don't. I just have to remember it. And so our osteoblasts are going to be on the surface of our compact bone. So we'll have, imagine, we have, this line is the outside border of our bone. So this is the inside of the bone over here. This is the outside. Our periosteum is here. This is going to have the osteogenic cells, the ones that make the osteoblasts. And then once the osteogenic cells turn into osteoblasts, we'll have osteoblasts on the actual surface of the bone. Because when they put bone down, they need to put it on the existing bone. If they put it over here, now there's an air gap there, and that's not going to work. So they need to put new bone on the existing surface, and so they're going to be right on the existing bone. They're not going to make that hard mineralized bone though. They're essentially going to make collagen. It's organic. Organic means carbon. Think of all the biomolecules that we talked about, right? The proteins, the carbohydrates, the lipids. There's a lot of carbon in that. That's organic material. That's what these osteoblasts are going to make. They put it down, and then over time, it will harden. So they don't put down ready to make bone. If you've ever laid cement, you know you don't mix up a batch of hard cement and put it down. You make up something soft so that you can work with it, you put it down, and then over time it's going to harden. when we put stress on our bone, it's going to make these osteogenic cells multiply very quickly and turn into osteoblasts. And so if you've ever broken a bone, a lot of times they'll tell you that when it heals, it's actually going to be stronger than it was when it started. Because when you break a bone, it actually does in fact get stronger. It makes more bone, a stronger bone, than you had to start with. If you exercise a lot, your bones will get stronger even if you don't fracture them. Because you're constantly putting the little micro fractures in them that have to get fixed. And so when it gets fixed, it gets stronger. These osteoblasts are going to put out a hormone called osteocalcin. This has a couple different purposes. Number one is going to make our pancreas secrete insulin, and it's going to make our adipocytes more sensitive to insulin. And so this is kind of a crosstalk between systems, right? We're talking about the skeletal system, but what does this seem like? What system does that sound like it is?
Endocrine.
Endocrine, yeah. And so what we're going to see is skeletal system is going to send signals like this, but it's also going to receive a lot of signals that are going to tell it whether it should dissolve bone or make bone. So osteoblasts make bone, but eventually they bury themselves. So imagine we have, remember this is the outside layer of our bone, we have these osteoblasts sitting here. If they were smart, they would put down a layer and then take a step back. They put down a layer and take a step back. But they're not. They're just little cells. They don't know any better. So eventually, they get completely buried in bone. So now this is the outside, and now there's osteoblasts here. But the old osteoblasts don't just die. They become what are called osteocytes. And so some of these terms are terms that we saw in our tissue lecture. So we saw the lacuna. These are the little tiny cavities that the cells kind of saved an air hole for themselves. They saw that they were getting buried, so they kind of put their arms out and said, well, I'm not going to fill in anywhere within my arm's length. And so you have these little cavities with these osteocytes in them. And they have these canaliculi, which allows them to send signals between themselves. Imagine a little tube at the bank where they put the thing in and your money goes away and it magically shows up at the other end, right? It allows them to send signals from one lacuna to another. There are also parts of these osteocytes called cytoplasmic processes that reach into the canaliculi so they can touch each other. So imagine you have one of these lacuna here, another one here with an osteocyte here, an osteocyte here. Then you have that tube connecting them. The tube is the canaliculi. But these osteocytes don't just stay there. They have a little finger that's going to come about halfway through. And so they can meet in the middle and they can talk to each other. And so if one cell, one of these, gets a signal to do one thing, it's going to pass the word on to the other. Whether that be to die, whether that be to absorb bone or put down bone, change what type of cell they are, doesn't really matter. In this case, they're all connected to each other, so they can spread the word. So we said they can reabsorb or deposit it. These are the cells that are going to tell when your bone is stressed. They're going to feel that the bone is flexing. They're going to sense that there are little cracks. And then they're going to send signals that are going to cause the bone to remodel. So remodeling is going to be that process of breaking down a little bit so that you can build up. Finally, we have the osteoclasts. So we have osteogenic cells, make osteoblasts, which make bone, osteocytes, which are osteoblasts that got trapped, and now can kind of do multiple purposes. And then there are osteoclasts, which have no purpose other than to dissolve bone. And these are going to be on the outside along with the osteoblasts. So you'll have both of them right next to each other. In some cases, they'll be working at the same time. Other times, one will take a break and the other one will take over. So these come not from the osteogenic cells. These actually come from the bone marrow, the cells that make blood cells. So they have a different lineage, they come from a different place, so they have a very different purpose. These are really big cells, and they actually come from the fact that multiple cells in the bone marrow are going to merge together to make one big cell. And because of that, they're going to have multiple nuclei. So now we have another cell type that has multiple nuclei. What is the other one that could very well be on the lab exam? Skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle. Just skeletal muscle. So on these osteoclasts, there's something called a ruffled border. So we've taken multiple stem cells, we've combined them together into one big osteoclast, and on that is this ruffled border. That's going to allow a lot of surface area contact between the osteoclast and the bone. So at this ruffled border is where the bone resorption or the dissolving is going to take place. Yeah?
Does that fall under cilia?
No, so cilia would be kind of a hard structure, something that's under control, right? So this is not under control. If you're going to put it into one of those little projections that we had, what do you think is probably the closest thing?
Like the intestinal cells?
Yeah, what were those?
Villi?
Microvilli, yeah. So to me, if you're going to classify this as microvilli, cilia, or what was the third type? Flagella. To me, this is much closer to microvilli. When you have these, they don't sit on a perfect flat surface. You're going to have a little dip. And they're going to exist in this dip with the ruffled border here. Why do you think that dip is there? Imagine a mine in the earth. What happens as you take rock out of your mine? It gets deeper. So if this serves no purpose other than to absorb bone, where it's sitting is just going to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So it's going to exist in this little pit that was called a resorption bay. And resorption, like I said, is the dissolving of our bone. It's absorbing is putting on, resorption is undoing that. So it's taking it off.
Does it destroy the porosity?
Yeah. It's going to go right through. So next we're going to talk about the matrix. And the matrix is going to be essentially the fibers and the minerals in our compact bone. And so when we look at that matrix, 2/3 of it is going to be inorganic, so that's going to be the minerals, and then there's going to be 1/3 organic, which is going to be the structural support, the framework underneath that mineral. So the organic matter is what's made by the osteoblasts. Remember that osteoblasts don't make mineralized bone. It's going to be primarily collagen with some more carbohydrate protein. There's some examples here, but I'm not too concerned about knowing the exact type. As long as you know there's collagen and then carbohydrate and protein. The inorganic matter is mostly what's called hydroxyapatite as calcium phosphate. And so it's calcium phosphate. So it's calcium and phosphate, both of which make up a lot of our bone and are very important for other purposes, there's going to be about 10% calcium carbonate, which is essentially chalk. And then there's about 5% other stuff. So the vast majority of our bone is calcium phosphate with a decent amount of calcium carbonate. So this is essentially the type of figure that we saw when we talked about bone tissue. And so if we look at this, remember there are these canals, which are central canals, and then around them there are these kind of circles. And so, as a whole, we call this a Haversian system or an osteon. And so that is one of these central canals with the lines going around it. So around that central canal, there are lines making perfect circles around them. Those are going to be these concentric lamella. And then there's going to be perforating canals. Perforating canals go sideways. That's going to allow communication in blood vessels to go from one central canal to another. In addition to the concentric lamella, there are circumferential lamella. These go around the entire bone. So these aren't really connected to any one central canal, whereas these go around that canal. This one ignores all of the canals and just goes around the entire bone. That's the circumferential lamella. And then in between these, there are these interstitial lamella. So if we look, there are some like this, and this, and that, here and there. They don't seem to be part of any specific lamella going around either a central canal or the bone itself. They're essentially just kind of filling in the space. So that is long bone. Long bone, and really talking about the dense or the compact bone on the outside. Then the inside we have the spongy bone. Spongy bone we didn't talk, I don't think, as much about, although we did touch on it. What we have in the spongy bone is kind of a, they call it a lattice, which is a good word for it, but it looks like a sponge, right? And so in the sponge, we have all of these little ruffles, and those ruffles are going to be bone, and all of those ruffles are going to be covered by the endosteum. And the bone in the spongy area are called trabecula. So all of these little processes are trabecula. In between them, in the empty spaces, is where the bone marrow is going to be. So in spongy bone, you're going to have bone marrow, but it's not just a solid chunk of bone marrow. You have the lattice structure, and then in the spaces are the bone marrow. You're not going to see those osteons. You're not going to see the central canals. The osteocytes that you have are going to be right in the border between the bone and the bone marrow. So they're going to be right here. What was the purpose of the osteocytes?
Communicate to each other.
They can communicate to each other. What are they communicating about? Where did the osteocyte come from? It was an osteoblast that got buried. But once it got buried, we said it could still make bone, but what else could it do? It could reabsorb bone also. It's kind of a dual purpose cell. So here, in our spongy bone, we're not going to have too many osteoblasts. We're not really going to have osteoclasts, but we're going to have the osteocytes that can serve both purposes. Purpose of the spongy bone is to take up space, provide support, but not be very dense. If we were made up of 100% or all of our bones were compact bone, we would be very, very heavy, right? So allowing this in the middle is going to let us be much lighter. Let's take a break. Let's come back at 7 o'clock. with 7 minutes from now.
I need to do what you're doing.
I know,
Oh my goodness.
I thought she was hearing me crackle over. Like,
Oh, I think I just tried that one. Whatever they are, they can't be divided. What are they?
How long is that? How far along they're gonna go for you? Probably want to slow it down a lot.
Certain types. So certain types of cancer come a long way. Other types of cancer,
No.
we're giving the same drugs that we're giving for 7 decades. But then there are other types of cancer that, unfortunately, basically
I like had fun in the morning, like when I
Right.
first woke up, and then
pancreatic cancer.
from
You get a
one
diagnosis of
and
pancreatic
it's
cancer.
like straight
You
on.
generally have,
Black coffee.
there's just no, it's horrible.
Was like the end goal, like reverse it or even?
I don't really, nobody really cares, as long as it goes away, right? Make it go away and with little damage to the normal tissue.
So what
You
did
do
you?
a lot on the cell level,
So my work, I'm either doing living things, I'm usually working, occasionally I'll animal, mouse and rat, or I'll be dealing with human tissues. I don't need people. So I'll get like tumor samples. So I'll figure something out in the cell, and then I'll say, well, let me look at the tissue, see if I see the same thing. Or I'll say, I wonder if this exists. See if it exists, and try to figure it out.
so when you do the meditation, you just come up with questions to ask yourself about what you're looking for.
No, when I leave the lab, I don't think about lab. I don't think about tissues.
But you didn't say anything about going in every day.
It's called grad school. Grad school is very unusual. It's a, no, so grad school teaches you how to pick, basically what it does.
Oh,
So
yeah,
it
that's
teaches you how to say, this is where I am now. How do I find the new question? And how do I go about answering it? So that every person will say this. So everybody has different questions. They have
When I
different
go out for
techniques that they're comfortable with. So they may take different routes as far as
got
that.
hand
Would you do your
So they had to open
So there was really two
and they had
main
a,
things. So
I can't remember what
there
it's
was
called. It's
sort
where
of
like the little
cancer
ball,
cell
what is it called?
biology part.
So they had to
You
go.
remember you had the central
Anyway,
zones. And so I
yeah,
was looking
for
at
him,
the
it's
certain
not
type of
that
breast
it's
cancer.
antibiotics and to culture
The
it,
central
it's like
zones
over $500.
overduplicate, and so there's too many of them.
Because I wanted to
So
make
it's
sure,
pulling
because it
the
was
two
like,
cells. It can actually pull in 3 or 4 cells.
I'll never take
When
the
that
dog.
happens, none of the cells have the right chromosome.
It's too much of like a mill of
imbalances in genes, so everything was haywire.
Thank you so
So I'm looking at what causes that overduplication. And I really enjoy computer modeling of drugs. So you take proteins, how the computer do all these computations, finding a drug that's going to cause you to respond. So then it tells you this is wrong, this is right. So the computer, I really think that's the
What were your results?
I found the
Where are you
function, but it's
Yeah, what's your
well above expectations. You guys talking about.
No.
So we had our spongy bone, and we said that in the spaces in the spongy bone is bone marrow. And bone marrow is a term that we're all familiar with. We know kind of what bone marrow is, but we don't actually know what bone marrow is for the most part. So bone marrow is a soft tissue. It is not hard. It is soft tissue. And it's going to be in the cavities of the long bone. And so in that marrow cavity, in the diaphysis, and it's also going to be in the small open spots of the spongy bone. And there are two types. There's red marrow and yellow marrow. So red marrow is also called myeloid tissue, but red marrow is the term that I want you to know. This tissue is what's called hemopoietic. So hemopoietic tissue makes red blood cells. So red marrow makes blood cells, including red blood cells. Okay? Red marrow is what we think of probably when we think of bone marrow. We hear about people who need bone marrow transplants. That's going to be red marrow. Usually there's something wrong with your immune system, and so immune system is going to be things like white blood cells. And so this is going to be coming from the red bone marrow. In a child, this is pretty much the only bone marrow they have. They're growing a lot, they need a lot of blood, and so they have a lot of this red bone marrow. But in adult, we're just kind of trying to maintain the status quo. So we don't need quite as much. The red bone marrow that we have, most of it's going to be in our skull, some other places, but the pelvis is a big location of the red bone marrow. If anyone has ever had a bone marrow transplant or had bone marrow taken out or been tested for their bone marrow, usually they go into their pelvis. There's a lot of red bone marrow in there because it's a very big bone. It's a very thick, heavy bone with a lot of space for this bone marrow. And then there's the yellow marrow. We're going to have yellow marrow. Kids are not going to have yellow marrow. So this is primarily going to be in the diaphysis. So the red marrow is going to be in the epiphyses on the end. The yellow marrow is going to be in the diaphysis in the middle. This is red marrow when we were a kid, but now it's converted into yellow marrow. Instead of having this hemopoietic tissue, it's going to be kind of fatty. It's going to have some just adipose tissue. Believe it or not, if we need it, this yellow marrow can in fact go back to being red marrow. The cells are still there. There's not as many of them, and they're not actively making blood. But kind of the stem cells are still there, and if called upon, they can divide to make a whole bunch more of this hemopoietic tissue and then start making the blood. Okay, so that's the inside. Now let's come back to the outside, okay? So we talked about the bone structures. We said that they're going to grow at those epiphyseal plates, but we didn't talk about how a bone actually grows. And so growth of bone is osteogenesis. There are also ossification. When we're little, when we're a fetus, we have two methods of bone growth going on. There's intramembranous ossification, and then there's endochondral ossification. We'll talk about each one in depth about how they work. So this is an intramembranous ossification. In this part here, there's some terms that you don't need to know. There's mesenchyme and mesenchymal. Those aren't things that we've talked about yet, okay? This picture is in a fetus. This is an embryo. So these are tissues that are only present in the embryo. By the time we're born, they're gone. Essentially, mesenchymal, the mesenchyme, and the mesenchymal cells are sort of undifferentiated cells. Imagine an embryo. There's a lot of cells there that haven't really turned into anything yet. That's going to be mesenchyme. But in this mesenchyme, there is going to be blood vessels and then actual differentiated cells